Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Do I Have Time For This? The series that looks at old and new video games, from indie to AAA and everything in between, to help you figure out if you've got the time to play, finish, 100% complete a game, or to just leave it in your backlog to forever gather dust. Today we're diving into cosmic body horror in the North Sea with Still Wakes the Deep, a linear story game from the England-based developer The Chinese Room under the banner of Sumo Digital. You may hear linear story game and think walking simulator, and you're not too far off, but I feel Still Wakes the Deep makes a strong impression from the offset that culminates in a great immersive story with a light sprinkling of interactive game elements. It also recently had a DLC release titled Siren's Rest, which expands on the outcome of the main story. I aim to cover both in this video, but let's start at the start. Still Wakes the Deep takes place in the North Sea on an oil rig called the Bira D, wherein our protagonist Kaz is a somewhat subpar electrician, having got the job from his best mate Roy. Kaz is trying to escape from something that happened on the mainland, which we never fully get the details of, but all of this becomes of little concern once the inciting incident happens. Being forced to keep drilling for oil despite concerns something's not quite right by a manager I'm sure all of us have had at some point, the Bira D strikes more than oil and is rapidly plunged into chaos as an otherworldly entity takes charge of the rig. As always, a bit of admin before we begin. I'm playing this game on my beefy PC rig via Steam, and had no performance issues whatsoever, save for a few buggy looking ropes. I've seen nothing around performance being bad on console either, but as always, buyer beware before purchasing. Equal parts a real British drama and the movie The Thing. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into these freezing cold waters and see what lies in the murky depths.
Fuck! Shit! Yeah, fucking go!
This game gets off to a fairly slow start, giving you the opportunity to catch up with different workers on the rig and get some setup for character and story moments later on. As I say, this is a very narrative heavy game, meaning the emphasis here is more on the story, characters and voice acting, rather than what you actually play. I would say this ultimately ends up being my main critique with the game, that there could be more in the way of gameplay, but first, let's get on to the positives. The setting of the Bira D is immediately fully realised and believable from the moment you step into Kaz's shoes. The game is set in the 1970s, and everything looks spot on for the setting, and as you'd expect from a contingent of Scottish oil rig workers in the 70s, everyone's as foul-mouthed as they come. The thing is, when it comes to Scottish voice acting in games and animations, you often get a lot of parody and stereotype.
Oh, this is your doing, Willie. I'll turn your groin to pudding.
Oh, you speak like a poet, but you punch like one too.
Here though, you'll hear familiar voices of Scottish actors that often appear in British TV dramas, and they give their roles the full gravitas that they deserve. Couple this with the Scottish words and phrases incorporated into the script like canny, the day, and mare, and this just becomes a fully immersive experience that really lets you sink into the game's setting. A truly believable script gives us genuine reactions you'd expect of people in these situations, and the situation is like nothing they've ever seen. Once the event takes place and the entity is awakened as it were, the entire rig goes to hell, with explosions left and right, flooding, and of course, the entity itself. I've been tiptoeing around this as people often do when they talk about Still Wakes the Deep, but I have to mention it to fully review the game. Drawing the comparisons from The Thing, it's the biomass that takes over the Bira D, which looks like veins and muscles wrapping around the structure itself and permeating the man-made structure. This then expands into body horror as the crew of the oil rig are slowly hunted down and overtaken by it as well. These moments where you see people interwoven into an alien mass with just a face sticking out is so reminiscent of The Thing or Colour Out of Space, and it's so gross.
Disgusting!
On top of this, you find members of the crew have been changed by the entity, and they stalk the claustrophobic corridors of the rig, trying to merge with any humans they come across. And it's here we should talk about what you actually do here, as hiding from these former crewmates alongside platforming around the rig is pretty much the entirety of the gameplay. As with many first-person horror games, the majority of the game is hiding in lockers, throwing distraction items and peeking around corners to avoid these body horror monstrosities. Here it always felt really responsive, and never clunky or unfair, as sometimes in these types of games you can get stuck fumbling with the door when something is chasing you. I never felt particularly challenged in these set pieces. In some cases you have to run away or sneak around, but there's no parts that feel unfair or even remotely had me thinking. On top of this, the traversal in the game is pretty basic. Sometimes it can be a bit of a slog where you have to laboriously press 4 buttons to start up a generator and doesn't really feel engaging. Aside from an odd occasion where you might be climbing and have to hold on, I was never stuck on where to go or had to stop to think about how to get from A to B. It's pretty linear. I don't find this to be particularly negative, as there's nothing wrong with basically playing a movie, but I do think there was significant scope to add in some features and systems that would have helped boost the gameplay here. For instance, Kaz is an electrician by trade, but the only actual electrician stuff he does is replacing a fuse by pressing and holding one button. I get that as part of the story he's not really fit for an oil rig job, but surely the Chinese room could have implemented a few join the dots or maybe even some math-based current puzzles to flesh out the sequences where you're fixing a switch or restarting generators. I don't think the game had to turn into The Witness, but something aside from pressing 1 or 2 buttons would have been beneficial. Another piece of gameplay that was light touch but never went further was an almost survival mechanic, whereby if Kaz swims in the freezing water in any section, you'll have to stick by a heater for it a bit afterwards to warm up. I know in order to get on with the game you couldn't just sit there with a space blanket on for 3 hours, but we could have had some section where we had to go from heater to heater or use fires to stop things freezing over. Anything to just add some more survival elements that aren't too intrusive, but add more to the gameplay offering. Gameplay aside, I want to praise the unfiltered vibes of this game. For being a AA game, Still Wakes the Deep looks incredible, especially the weather and the water, which perfectly captures the cool, depressive feel of the North Sea. On top of this, you spend a lot of time in dark, wet environments with only a torch to see in the pitch black, with a button solely dedicated to looking behind you to boost the paranoia you get sneaking around the oil rig. If you get thalassophobia or submechanophobia, avoid this game like the plague. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of deep water, and being stuck in a room filling with water or jumping over a precipice that drops straight into the ocean can be terrifying for some, and this game absolutely nails that feeling. It also has a very clever way of reusing areas, as there'll be times where you need to revisit accommodation or walk across the outside of the oil rig, but every time you return, more of the entity will have taken a hold of the rig. Something will be underwater, or parts will have collapsed, revealing new paths and obstacles. When you're working on a budget, this is an extremely clever way of reusing assets, and it's always nice to see some AA developer magic.
Hocus pocus, there's pizza on your focus.
This covers the main feel of the game, but how about the recently released Siren's Rest DLC? Well, unfortunately this one's a mixed bag of very high highs and straight disappointing lows. At the start of Siren's Rest, I was instantly more engaged than with the main game, despite the lack of characters in the opening, with just Myra and Rob being alone in the diving bell at the bottom of the ocean. Here you're playing as Myra, who is clearly searching for someone amongst the ruins of the Bira D, hoping to bring peace to the relatives of the people lost in the original disaster and find a cause for what happened. In a far less linear affair, the DLC starts you off in a wide open expanse, where you swim around points of interest before starting down the main objective. It's good to have a bit more freedom in what you do, even though the idea of being stuck miles underwater in the dark, attached to essentially an umbilical cord, is inherently terrifying. It also didn't escape my notice that you're linked up most of the time, the same way the characters of the main game ended up attached to the entity. Nicely done, the Chinese room. This open area exploration is rewarded with collectibles and some great dialogue, and just feels more rewarding in terms of the gameplay overall, whilst keeping the high quality voice acting and script. The downside of the DLC is actually what happens in it. I will of course avoid spoilers, but going into Siren's Rest you'll have certain questions that will never really get answers, and the entire first 2 chapters build suspense perfectly for an Act 3 payoff which just results in a very short sequence with a faceless and character devoid horror that just feels like a bit of a wet fart after so much build up. It's such a shame that it takes about 2 hours to get somewhere, only for it to be a complete anticlimax that doesn't offer any real closure on the main game itself. Given we see characters twist into monsters in the main game, and the relationships Kaz has makes the horror more personal, it feels like there's a huge open goal here that was missed. Sometimes mysteries are best left that way, but when you pose a DLC around potentially unearthing the mysteries of the main game, it feels a little pointless to end it in similar fashion, with things left unanswered. So let's get down to it. How long does this game take? I'll break this section down into 3 sections a bit like I usually do, but I'll keep the main game and the DLC separate. For my experience with the main game, given it's a linear experience with not a lot of room to go off the beaten path, my personal playthrough aligns with the mainline experience at 4.5 hours. For a completionist playthrough where you're likely going to need a second playthrough, which once you know where to go and you're skipping some achievements that take time, you're looking at about 8 hours. For the Siren's Rest DLC, I finished it in about 2.5 hours, but I spent a lot of time exploring all the nooks and crannies. A mainline playthrough doing just the story stuff, you can get through it in about an hour. For the full completionist experience, there aren't many tough trophies, but again you're likely to need 2 playthroughs, so this will take you about 4 hours. The amount of time you spend playing Still Wakes the Deep massively depends on how much you want to get achievements. Across the main game and the DLC there's 59 in total, and the majority are hidden achievements with fairly obscure motivations behind them. As such, you're unlikely to even know what to do to unlock them without a guide. The actual actions you need to take aren't difficult, but some are missable, so you'll need to utilise Chapter Select to go back and get some. On top of this, there's an achievement for playing both the main game and Siren's Rest with the language set to Scottish Gaelic, which you'd never know unless you looked it up and can't be changed mid-playthrough, causing you to have to start a new game. I got this game at a 50% discount, meaning it only cost around £15 or $15, and for that price alongside the DLC which only cost around £8, I'd say this game gives you a solid and enjoyable story. It's almost like an interactive movie, and with the star-filled cast of voice actors, I'd say at a discount you do get your money's worth. When it comes to respecting your time, Still Wakes the Deep is a fairly short game and has set area transitions where you know you can comfortably put the game down and come back to it later. With it being a relatively short and linear game, it can be picked up and put down relatively easily without it ruining the experience, but I do think you should set aside a good hour or two to get yourself really immersed in what the Chinese room has made here. Checkpointing is fairly generous and the loading screen is a fun trip if you need to restart, so you'll not mind the small amount of time you may lose if you have to restart a section. I recommend Still Wakes the Deep and the Siren's Rest DLC if you're a certain kind of gamer. The setting, characters, world building and voice acting is exemplary, and honestly feels more like watching a short TV series like Chernobyl rather than playing a game. The DLC doubling down on the great script and atmosphere, only with added gameplay features. However, the game's greatest strength can be seen by some as a weakness, and if you're the type of person who would rather watch a movie than play it, this game might not be for you. Added agency to the gameplay, introduction of some light puzzle and survival mechanics would have significantly raised my recommendation, but in its released state, Still Wakes the Deep is still at its heart a walking simulator. While some are alright with this and some are not, it just depends on if you value gameplay so strongly that you'd overlook such a solid and enjoyable horror story. Whilst I feel the main game trumps the DLC in terms of the story and where it ends up, Siren's Rest provides significantly more gameplay opportunities and far better tension build up to do some great horror. The Chinese room are so close to greatness if they just combine these two things together. Full of personal tragedy, loss and intrigue, Still Wakes the Deep creates an incredible story to get lost in that has a near perfect pace, and as long as you know of the game's format going in and you're a fan of horror, I promise you're not going to be disappointed. Do you have time for Still Wakes the Deep? On this channel I like to give my thoughts on the game alongside a bit more of a deep dive on the time you have to invest, so you know what you're getting into, because time is precious, right? If you enjoyed the video or found it useful, feel free to like and share. If you subscribe, I'm looking to put out regular content like this alongside some more in-depth video essays and freeform videos, so stick around, and if you have any requests on future videos, just drop them in the comments. And finally, if you want to come chat with me, you can find me over on x.com/gracious_rhino. I'm Gracious Rhino, look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.